Hey guys, welcome to BP, the Bible Perspective. Let's discuss 3 reasons pastors cover and hide their sins. But before we get into it, please like and share this video and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comment section below. All comments are welcome. What you're looking at is the pictures of some of the most famous pastors of modern time. And what they all have in common is that in one way or the other, they have fallen into sin. They were disgraced, they were defrocked, all because of their sin. Now, not all of them were sexual sins, by the way, but most of them were. And I want to discuss 3 reasons why, when they do fall in sins, why there was great effort to cover it up. Great effort to hide the sin. And I've broken it down to 3 reasons. 3 reasons. Shame, greed, and evil. We'll come back to that for a moment. But let me say this, because I know a lot of people hate when you talk about their pastors. They get offended. They would lodge more condemnation on me for talking about their sins than the people who's actually committing the sins. So this is a touchy subject to a lot of people. And by the way, this kind of collection doesn't even scratch the surface of the number of pastors and ministers who have sinned. And also, let me say this. I'm not condemning these ministers. I'm not condemning them. I'm not judging them. However, their sin is their sin. I'll caution anyone who want to pass judgment, just remember the only difference between these ministers and us is their sins were publicly exposed. And they had to deal with the consequences of their sins publicly. Many of us don't, so we can hide our sins, and so just remember, God's mercy is never ending. Now, also, let me just say this, that ministers falling is nothing new. Let us not forget David, King David. And you remember that David, one of his blotches on his record. Now, understand who King David was. King David was the greatest king that Israel ever had. David was so great that God himself said that he is a man after my own heart. Now, just think about that for a moment. When God says you're a man after your own heart. And David was so great, so godly, and so righteous, he ministered justice, that his kingdom, in a sense, is kind of established as the bloodline one of Jesus. But also, we're going to see David will rule over Israel throughout even the millennial reign of Christ. So David is a very important person, but one of his worst sins, of course, was with Bathsheba. Now, Bathsheba was the wife of Uriah. She was a very extremely beautiful woman. And one spring, when the armies went out to battle, David stayed home. He went out onto his terrace and he was able to see Bathsheba bathing. Inflamed by lust, he called for her, had an affair. But like a lot of men who have affairs, they like to hit it and quit it. Just, hey, I'm done. But one of the problems, Bathsheba got pregnant. She informed David that she got pregnant. Now David, in an attempt to cover his sin, um, because again, abortions sort of wasn't the mind frame of the time, and certainly medically they wasn't available. So in his mind, he said, "Let me call her husband Uriah." He called Uriah. Now Uriah was one of David's mighty 30 warriors. And if you go back and you read the story, you had to have accomplished some mighty feats to be named and listed in what is known as David's 30 mighty men. And so he was married to Bathsheba. God had blessed him with a beautiful wife, but adultery. Now, unbeknownst to Uriah, David calls him off of the battlefield and tried to entice him to go home. Go home to your beautiful wife. He asked him, hey, how's the battle going? And then it was like, hey, now go home to that beautiful wife of yours, right? Just go home to your beautiful wife. But Uriah, being the faithful soldier, did not go home. He said, I cannot go home and enjoy my wife while my brothers are out fighting. My fellow soldiers are fighting on the battlefield. And seeing that David could not persuade him, David writes a letter, seals it, and sends it by Uriah to Joab, the most wicked chief military commanders. Now, Joab was an extremely competent military commander. He was just wicked. Now, what is sad about this is that what Uriah did not realize is that the letter he was carrying was his death warrant. Because then David had written to Uriah, and think about this, of all people, David written to Joab, and of all people, Joab, the most wicked person, the one that David would oftentimes say, my sister's son, by the way, Joab was his nephew, my sister's son, these guys weary me because they were wicked. And he writes this letter to Joab and says, when you guys get into the fight, put Uriah at the front and then withdraw from him. And they did, and Uriah was killed. And the sad part about this, of course, is that David killed a faithful good man. Now, God would punish David for this, and David's life would never be the same after this. But again, you see that David, a man after God's own heart, can sin. So there's a lot of lessons with this story here. One, don't sin. But if you do, God will be merciful. And it means that God is not through with you. And, for a lot of cases too, you could kind of understand then why you could see some of these faces and wonder, well, how could God use these men after their sins? But he does. Okay? So again, I want to break down, shame, greed, and evil. These are one of the 3 reasons, not the only reason, but just for the sake of this video, 3 reasons why pastors seek to cover and hide their sins. Now, when we talk about shame, we're talking about obviously the shame, the embarrassment of falling into sin, the shame of being exposed, the fear of being exposed. So they had to go through great lengths to cover that. Okay? And also, too, I can throw in the shame of failing and hurting the movement, the cause, the ministry. Another thing is greed. A lot of them go through great lengths to prevent the failure of the ministry. Once they've been exposed, they don't necessarily think about it, obviously, when they're committing the sin. But once they've been exposed, They don't want the ministry to fail. Good money, fame, fortune, and they could lose all of that. Now that's when it's evil, because many of them are just plain evil. What they're doing, the fact their ministries themselves, how they deceive the people of God, mislead the people of God, false doctrines. And so they just do it because they're just plain evil, okay? Now, look at Paul Crouch. He was the founder of the largest Christian television network, TBN. And it was discovered probably later in his life. There's probably many things that were not covered, but was discovered later in his life. He was involved in a homosexual relationship with a former prison inmate. That they hired him in the ministry. Paul got involved with them, and then it was reported that the ministry was paying him somewhere around the neighborhood of $200,000, I think, a year or whatever. But the inmate got greedy, wanted more, wanted to double it. And that's when Paul's sin came out. And the ministry was exposed for trying to cover the sin by paying the hush money. Now, you can put a lot of questions about TBN itself, but that's not the focus of this video. Marcus Lamb, founder of the second largest Christian television network, Daystar, had an affair, but some of his employees wanted to sue him. That's one of the bizarre stories. They wanted to sue him because they said he misled us because we thought we was working in a moral Christian atmosphere. Now, of course, the money that they were trying to sue him for, okay, they thought would ease their pain. One of the things about people in money, however, is when you push them too far, they're not giving up their money. And they just kind of go down with the ship, taking their money with them. And Marcus Lamb got his wife and sat on TV and confessed to the adulterous affair. Now, Ted Haggard pastored a large church in Colorado Springs, but he also was head of the National Association of Evangelicals, which had, at the time, 30 million members, a lot of votes. But he was too caught up in a homosexual relationship, and he did his best to lie and cover it up. Even when people knew, when they would ask him the question, hey, you were caught, did you buy meth? There was meth involved. So there was meth, and then there was the relationship with his masseuse, okay? Carl Letts. Now, Carl Letts. Now, let me talk about first about Brian Houston. Brian Houston was the founder of Hillsong Ministries, and this is sort of a phenomenal explosion of these churches that started in Australia, and they have congregations all over the world. And what is amazing about these congregations, we're talking stadium size. So we're talking about they have stadiums of the 15 to 20,000 all over the world. He was caught up in an affair. Now, one of his pastors, one of the most famous pastors in America, Carl Letts, he's kind of famous because Justin Bieber was one of his members that he was mentoring. Carl Letts, pastor of a large church, was caught up in an affair. Bob Coy. By the way, I haven't forgotten about Martin Luther King. I'll get back to him in a moment. All right. But Bob Coy was pastor of a Calvary Chapel church in Florida. Again, he was caught up in an affair and had to resign. Zachary Timms, who looks like Will Smith's brother. I'm kidding. But he pastored a large church in Florida. Now, it's kind of interesting. Later, I'm going to talk about Paula White. And Paula White is now pastoring his church. Okay? But Zachary Timms was carrying on an affair with a stripper in Paris, France. So he would fly over to France, I guess, to have this affair. And I guess he might have even flown her over across the Atlantic. Sadly, he was found dead in a hotel room, and it is believed by a drug overdose. And what is amazing that his family is doing all they can to cover up the cause of his death. Now, I told you Paula White, right there, you see in the middle, who became Trump's spiritual advisor and head of his evangelical board of his presidency. Had been in multiple marriages and even affairs, even linked to Benny Hinn, you see there. Okay? But the problem I have with Paula White is, I'm going to say, shame is not her game, but greed and evil is, because she purposely misleads the people of God. Kat Kerr is a false prophetess. She is actually still in the ministry. You see her on the Kenneth Copeland network, and she has made numerous false prophecies. Okay? So while it's not known anywhere, it's not sexual sins, just to me, the evilness of perpetrating a lie. Now, Jim Bakker, probably in the modern times, probably one of the first pastors. He wasn't the only one, but he had one of the largest Christian networks, not television networks, but just shows, the PTL Club. And of course, he fell into adultery. He went to jail and prison for fraud. Okay, and even now he's back on TV doing some of the same tricks. He did some craziness. Jimmy Swaggart. Okay, now Jimmy Swaggart is interesting because he, Jim Bakker and Jimmy Swaggart were both Assemblies of God. And so Jimmy Swaggart, who at the time was sort of the top guy, he had one of the largest ministries. He would brag so much about his ministry, it was unbelievable. But he also was very judgmental, and he actually pointed out, he was the one that brought about Jim Bakker's downfall. Now, he also brought about another man by the name of Marvin Gorman at the time. A lot of people didn't know as much about him. But Marvin was very upset about his downfall that was brought about by Jimmy Swaggart. And so revenge, and yes, these were ministers acting like this. In revenge, Marvin Gorman hired a private investigator and found out that Jimmy was seeing a prostitute. Now, even after being exposed, and what you see right there, and it's very tearful, one of the most, comedic, but also this is his repentance, admitting that he was caught. Now, you may also note that none of these ministers ever kind of came forward until after they were exposed. All right, but this was his tearful repentance. I have sinned, Lord, thing here. Ravi Zacharias, and I think it's kind of things did not come. His sin of adultery, and in fact, he was. You can almost say kind of what the Me Too movement did, but it kind of came after his death that he was just abused multiple women. Now, John Lowe, an Indiana pastor who had to step down because of his adulterous affair, Eddie Long, who pastored New Birth Church in Atlanta, was accused by several men of having homosexual relationships with him. He later passed away. And then Jamal Bryan, the church hired Jamal Bryan to take over Eddie Long's church. And this is kind of crazy because Jamal Bryan himself is riddled with scandal, affairs, adultery. Okay. And so again, you have to ask why did they hire him? Okay, Jack Sapp pastored one of the largest churches in Indiana, in Hammond, Indiana, and back then they were known for their bus ministry. They would bus Sunday school bus ministries. They would drive as far as 70 miles to pick up people to come bring them to Sunday school. But anyway, he is now in prison because of an affair of an underage girl taking her across state lines. Now, James McDonald is a very interesting person. James McDonald and Mark Driscoll, they didn't have sexual sins, but they were defrocked and put out of the churches because of their abuse. They were accused of being extremely abusive, okay? And that was the reason why they got off. But they had powerful, very large ministries. At one point, James McDonald had the Walk in the Word radio program, his church, and then also had an affiliation of churches. Now, what is interesting is that the guy next to him, Lonnie Frisbee, I'll get to him in a moment, but Lonnie Frisbee was a part of the Calvary Chapel movement. James McDonald kind of patterned the churches after the Calvary Chapel ministries, but he wasn't a Calvary Chapel pastor. Now, Lonnie Frisbee, as I said, if you go back in the 60s, what was called the Calvary Chapel movement, the Jesus People movement, Calvary Chapel was started by the late Chuck Smith in Costa Mesa, California. Now you see some of the well-known ministers, Bob Coy, if you remember, I talked about him, Bob Coy, let's go back up there. This pastor, Bob Coy, remember, he was a Calvary Chapel pastor in Florida. Lonnie Frisbee was there in the beginning of the explosion of the Calvary Chapel movement. But this guy, and it was amazing that the Calvary Chapel covered his sin. He was really a flaming homosexual. And it was even reported he would go through this molesting boys. And the sin there with Calvary Chapel was that they knew he was doing this and they did not do anything about it. Now, Benny Hinn, of course, as I told you, was caught in, he confessed to a kind of a inappropriate relationship with Paula White, okay? And remember Paula White there in the middle, but he confessed. But the problem I have with Benny Hinn is that a lot of the stuff that he does is plain evil. His lies and deception, the healings. You know how many people that go to his ministry? I don't know if he's doing a lot of crusades these days, but people would go because we're talking people that were on deathbeds. Were going hoping that he would heal them because he bragged about being healing. You would see him blowing on people, waving his coat, and people falling out under the power of God, as they say. But no one ever got healed. And I can tell you, people I've known personally, personal pastors who have gone to his meeting just 2 days before their death. He was a fraud. And no other big ministers that can be as big a fraud as Jim Jones. And we can just say the epitome of evil. The epitome of evil. I'm going to come back to him in a moment. Let me talk about Jerry and Becky Falwell. Now, if you notice, they're the only ones I got here as a husband and wife. And the reason why Jerry Falwell is the son of one of the most prominent evangelical leaders. He founded the Moore Majority. His father, Jerry Falwell Sr., he, you could say, was instrumental in, of course, getting presidents elected. Was called the evangelicals, the Christian right. His father was a part of it. Well, those seeds, those apples fell far. Jerry Falwell, upon his father's death, took over the university that his father started. And it was reported that Jerry and his wife were not only abusive, but man, we're talking the almost epitome of the proverbial porn thing. Like, she was involved literally with the pool boy. Okay. And it was that Jerry would go in and watch them. Okay. So he was actually out. There was pictures where he was, there's some pictures out there where he was with one of the students that he was, they took the picture of it, and it was pants were unzipped and her pants were unzipped. It was bizarre. So again, the evilness that he thought, he was so the pride in and so again, no shame but greed and just evilness here. Now Jim Jones, of course, Jim Jones is probably one of the most evilest. You can just kind of like say pure evil. And the idea there, you could put him in that category alone. What is amazing about Jim Jones, he started out as a Pentecostal pastor. He goes from Indiana to San Francisco area. And then he leads his flock to Guyana, South America, where he commits the largest mass suicide, nearly 1,000 people. What is interesting about Jim Jones is that he was involved with just all kinds of sexual sins, but power. He was abusive. Here's the thing, Jim Jones was an atheist, but he deceived the people, deceived them. Now, I told you I want to get back to now Martin Luther King. You may want to say, well, now, why am I bringing Martin Luther King in there? One of the most, of course, revered figures of our times. Of course, leader of the modern civil rights movement. Who, the I Have a Dream speech at the time was the largest gathering on the Washington Mall, giving a speech about civil rights, right? Now, the problem here that Martin Luther King was, even though he was a great leader, he was a pastor, but numerous affairs, and they covered it up. And they covered it up because for the sake of the movement. And that wasn't right. So in other words, people around him knew of the numerous affairs he would have while he was out on the road, but they covered it up. So the point, you see, is that these men, all of these men here, and I'll close by saying this, that all of these men, though they have sinned, and for the various degrees, shame, greed, and evil, let me just say, God is still merciful, and God still loves them. And I want to say that because I'm not, when we talk about them, but again, these were the three reasons why you see that they went through great effort to cover their sins, the shame, the greed, and the evil of it. And I'm going to say this, and again, shame on us a lot of times because we tolerate that. Sometimes we see that. We can see things are wrong, but we won't say anything because they are beloved figures. And many times people, we close our eyes to that. But those are some of the reasons why, those three reasons why pastors will cover their sin. Shame, greed, and evil. Look, that is my perspective. I would love to hear your thoughts and opinions on this. add them to the comment section below. And remember, all comments are welcome. And don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. And as always, uh, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Also, I'll see you in the next video.